Okay, so, well, speaking of technical stuff, we enjoy covering technical content, like test and measurement equipment on this show. And quality initiatives run cutting edge technology. So it's only natural that we frequently talk about the Internet of Things, IoT, or sometimes, the industrial IoT, IIoT, big data, cloud computing, and other forward-facing developments that affect our industry. And a big part of that, of course, involves automation, whether it's, self-driving cars, one of my favorite topics, or robots on the shop floor, or drones zipping around in the air, machines that can, to a certain extent, think, have become ubiquitous in our world. But are there dangers as well as opportunities in these increasingly smart machines? And that's the premise behind our own Ryan Day's recent op-ed, Artificial Intelligence, Salvation or Skynet. Anybody remember Skynet?
Skynet? Of course, yeah.
Right.
Terminator, man.
And this appeared in yesterday's Thursday SIFT issue of Quality Digest newsletter. In this really well-researched article, Ryan offers a look at some of the hopes and fears and realities of AI, of artificial intelligence, with references to the perspectives and opinions of thought leaders like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Steve Mnuchin. Well, some of these guys are thought leaders at least.
But don't get political, Dirk. Why are you always doing that?
Right, exactly. The bottom line is that AI has the potential to greatly improve productivity and relieve the drudgery that's still found in manufacturing facilities around the world. And that's the salvation part of Ryan's headline. As for the Skynet part, well, does the phrase, "I'll be back," mean anything to you?
Yeah.
No, seriously, Mike.
Yes, that's right.
There isn't actually any fear that machines will one day gain consciousness, maybe, start replicating and upgrading themselves, and ultimately wipe out humanity.
There's no fear of that.
There's no fear of that. Some people are afraid of that.
Some people are afraid of that,
including some thought leaders.
Yeah, there are.
There was actually a great interview on NPR the other day about that AI is getting so good that some people who work in the AI industry are worried that in 15, 20 years, AI will have advanced to the point where if we aren't putting, let's say, protections in place now, we could have this a chance where artificial intelligence may accidentally do something that is unintended, because if it has the ability to write its own code, which some AI is doing right now, in other words, to make its own modifications to its own software, which is something that's being looked at, by the way. That's part of what's going on with self-driving cars, by the way, is they're self-learning as well. If that gets to the point where it runs uncontrolled, might artificial intelligence do something unexpected and actually cause harm?
Well, yeah, and that's the Skynet part of that. Is if you remember watching Terminator, where the machines gained consciousness and basically started eradicating humanity. I mean that's yeah. I mean
pesky humans.
But I mean it's like you're not value added, so you get out of here.
I'm sorry, you gotta
go. I mean I think that there are some legitimate concerns. Some of these are pretty overblown, but there's some legitimate concerns about what happens when we lose control of this, and if we lose control of it, and what happens when these machines begin to make decisions on their own for things. And it's not so much that it's this great disaster maybe, but it just things may happen, decisions may be made in an industrial setting that you didn't plan for.
Well, there's a good example of this. Yeah. There's a really good example of this. Remember that big stock market crash we had a few years ago where automated trading, it did something that nobody
expected it to do.
And all of a sudden it was like selling off all the stock because of something that nobody intended. Now they have circuit breakers and so forth in place.
We learned from that.
We learned from that. But that was an example of essentially artificial intelligence doing something that we did not anticipate.
But the thing is, machines will learn faster than us.
Yes.
So I mean, machine learned how to what it thought do what it was programmed to do. I thought, I use the word thought, but it did what it was programmed to do. We didn't think through all the parameters of that, and actually, the relentlessly logical. This is the fear for me. The relentlessly logical progression of machine intelligence doesn't take into account things like, well, if that happened, who would want that to happen? We wouldn't do that, right?
Right. A human wouldn't.
A human wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
And actually, it's interesting you talk about the automated, the self-driving car part of that, because when I was at Hexagon Live this summer in Vegas, they talked about this a lot. This idea that there's so much data that comes out of a self-driving, an automated car environment.
Right.
And yeah, it is self-learning. It has to be, because
Yeah.
I mean, when you think about a human being driving down a road, all the decisions that are just made,
Right.
automatically that
Right.
you don't even think about,
Right.
but have to be thought about in advance and programmed into the machine. And can the machine then learn to figure that out on their own
Right.
as it goes? Like, for instance, the example they use is a dark tunnel.
Okay.
Like, for instance, right now, when you're going through a dark tunnel, they can't figure out a way to program a car to keep going.
Oh, right.
It just stops,
Okay.
right? Because there's nothing to see.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? So if it can't perceive anything, now you and I, our minds know, well, the road's there.
Right.
We're going to have light in a couple of seconds, so we'll just keep going.
Right.
But the machine doesn't know how to do that. They can't figure out how to program the machine to do that
Okay.
yet.
Interesting. Yeah.
But they will at some
will,
point.
yeah.
So I mean, this whole idea about the chain of reactions and what happens when consciousness, that's a whole nother issue.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
we've had this argument ourselves.
Yeah.
I don't believe that there ever will be truly machine consciousness.
Yeah.
As we know it.
As we know it.
I mean,
but I did want to. I wanted to. So we can bring this down to kind of a manufacturing perspective as well. Is one of the things that we are working with a lot. Industry's working with a lot is cobots, robots that work alongside people. And to a certain extent, they're also self-learning robots. In other words, one of the things we talked about, it was a couple years ago, some experiments that are being done by MIT, where the robot is watching the human and learning from the human and adapting its own motions so that it stays out of the way of the human or modifies the human. And this was the interesting bit, and I don't know if anybody remembers me talking about this. The next step was, can the robot teach the human? In other words, if the robot detects that the human is making
wasted motion,
making wasted motion, can it in some way or another nudge the human into making a more value-adding motion, or take away the non-value-adding motion. And it might do that simply by blocking the human. It might do that by maybe speaking to the human, saying, hey, try doing this or whatever. And that's the part they haven't figured out, is how does the robot teach the human?
Right.
But that's kind of that next step. And this isn't science fiction. I mean, this is being worked on in industrial environments right now.
Where people and robots work together. And the same thing again with all self-driving cars, where it's like right now the idea is that you'd have self-driving car lanes and you'd have human lanes. They'd be separated.
Right.
Because the cars have a difficult time figuring out what the unpredictable humans will do.
Right.
That's the biggest issue. Is there's so many weird decisions that human drivers make, obviously, especially here in California.
Although there was a good video. All right, well, one more minute.
Yeah.
There is a good video. Oh man, I'm not sure even how you would Google it, but a self-driving car in Europe that detected an accident in front of the car that it was behind, because they have radar that skips underneath the car in front.
Okay.
And the guy, there was a dash cam going on, right? So the car actually, you see the self-driving car actually start to brake before you see the brake lights come on
the
in the
next
car
car.
in front of it.
How interesting.
And that was because the car ahead of it had, I don't know, braked suddenly or spun out or something, and the self-driving car actually saw ahead and actually started an evasive maneuver while braking before anybody else even knew it was happening. So I mean, there is a lot of advantages to this. I mean, it should, and even including detecting unexpected actions from a human driver. So
amazing, great
cool
stuff.